very much, Mr. Grieve. Can I pose the same question to Dr. Renwick, please?
Thank you very much, and I agree very much with everything that Gisela and Dominic have said. I won't attempt to repeat that. I think it's crucial to remember a number of features that have developed over the last 3 years. So one is, I think we've become increasingly conscious of the dangers of misinformation and disinformation in democracy. The DCMS committee has done really excellent work on that. The Lords Committee on Democracy and Digital Technologies has done, I think, a very important report on that. And of course, Dominic's committee did its report on Russia as well, which addresses part of this. A second kind of contextual shift is, I think we've seen, so that first point is kind of about the negatives of the difficulties facing democracy at present. We've also seen positives about democracy and the possibilities of doing referendums well in other countries. Clearly, we haven't had a referendum since 2016 in the UK, but we've seen, for example, increasing use of citizens' assemblies in the context of referendums in Ireland. We've seen other mechanisms for trying to engage people in thoughtful and considered discussion of matters in the context of referendum campaigns in a number of countries. So I think that context gives us reason to be hopeful about the direction that democracy is going in. And then I think third, it's also, Gisela pointed out that a future referendum might be on a very different subject. So it's very unlikely to be on the question of EU membership again. It's quite likely that the next referendum in the UK will be on either Scottish independence or on the question of Irish unification. And I've since working on the Independent Commission on Referendums over the last 18 months or so, I've been chairing a working group on unification referendums on the island of Ireland, which is looking into how a referendum on that issue would be conducted. And it happens that we are publishing our final report on that tomorrow. And there are big questions that I think it's important for this committee to deal with around if that's the sort of topic that is being put to a referendum, how do you ensure that there is proper regulation? So with that context in mind, I think as Gisela very much indicated, the whole of our report published in 2018, to my mind, very much still stands up. And I would perhaps just very quickly highlight, we emphasise the need for greater transparency in campaign spending, which largely requires legislation. We emphasise the need for greater transparency also in digital campaigning, and the legislation, which of course is more than 20 years old now, still doesn't adequately reflect the shift to digital campaigning. There's a little bit in the electoral integrity bill that is planned, but not very much. I had on my list also, as Dominic did, our recommendations around extending the prohibition on state-financed campaigning on one side as one of our key recommendations. We also recommended that lead campaigners should be designated as early as possible. There was clear disadvantage in 2016 for the Leave campaign in the fact that it was designated quite late on because the designation was contested, unlike on the Remain side. And if you're going to have a level playing field, then that needs to be addressed. And then finally, I think a lot could be done in order to improve the information provision in the context of a referendum campaign. I think the role of the Electoral Commission in that is fairly small, but I think a lot could be done.
Thank you to the three of you. Now to my colleague, Karen Smith, please.
Thank you, Chair. And my question is to Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, you're very welcome. We very much appreciate you, not a politician, coming to us from the experience in Ireland. Two parts to my questions. Firstly, looking back on some learning and then looking forward at legislation. So firstly, given the experience of a number of referendums which you've informed us about, what is your experience of the general conduct of referendums in Ireland so far?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the question. Well, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is we have vast experience in holding referendums in Ireland. At the latest count, it's north of 40 referendums have been held in a constitutional referendum since the Constitution in 1937. And actually, you know, the bulk of those have been held in recent years. So since 2000, we've held actually 19 referendums. So you could say on average we hold a referendum every year. More recent referendums, I guess how things have evolved in holding referendums. One of the most significant initiatives, I guess, was in 1998, which saw the establishment on a statutory basis of the establishment of a referendum commission when a referendum is being held. Now, it is discretionary for the minister to establish a referendum commission when a referendum is called, but the reality is that since 1998, every referendum that has been held, a commission has been established. And I guess just to touch on some of the things, I mean, Dr. Renwick mentioned at the end, the information provision role, and I think that's probably that's very central, and it's the central role that the Referendum Commission in Ireland plays. They have very specific functions under the legislation, and one of its most important ones is to prepare a statement containing, you know, a general explanation of the subject matter. And they prepare that statement and they distribute it to all households typically, and then make it available online and so on. They also have a very important role in encouraging people to come out and vote and voter participation. So they're the two key roles for the Commission. I guess its role in recent years has evolved somewhat, and that the chairperson of the Commission plays a very active role in national and local media in explaining the subject matter and to the electorate. So the experience, I think it's fair to say that the Commission is well regarded, and its statements and the public information campaigns that they run are well received by the voter.
Thank you. And in terms of, I'm exhausted at the idea of all those referendums, having just come through a couple, but in terms of the learning from the last one, is that undertaken by the Commission as well? Is that a sort of feedback loop to inform the next one?
Yeah, so there's a requirement after each commission. The commission is established once a constitutional amendment bill is passed by Parliament. The commission is established and commences its work at that point. They continue that work until the referendum is finished, and they report back to the Minister, to the Oireachtas, and that report sets out the nature of the campaign and how they fulfil their functions, and making recommendations as to the conduct of future campaigns. So I guess that reporting piece is important. And it's fair to say one of the recommendations that commissions have made over the years is the lack of time that they have, because they are only established at the point that a bill is passed Parliament, and at that point a referendum must be held. They're established on the publication of the constitutional amendment bill. But really, in essence, their information campaign can only start when the bill passes both houses, and that triggers a referendum must be held within 30 or between 30 and 90 days. So it's a relatively short window that they have to conduct their business. They are often critical of that short time frame that they have. That just brings me then to point out that in our electoral reform agenda at the moment, and the electoral reform bill that's currently before Parliament, there is the proposal to establish on a permanent statutory basis an electoral commission, which would take on the functions of the current referendum commission, and so that would be a permanent standing commission that would have that role.
And if you could just elaborate on that a little in terms of the impact of that proposal on the regulation of campaigners in Ireland, and the information to voters to be informed.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the key benefits of it will be that you have a permanent, independent statutory electoral commission, and that's what's been was recommended by a report of the Oireachtas a number of years ago, and the recommendation was to establish a permanent, independent statutory electoral body that would have responsibility generally in this area, a number of different electoral functions to establish initially and to build on those functions over time. I guess the fact that it is a permanent standing body should assist, one would think, in particularly in encouraging voter participation, so they'll have that ongoing role. It's not just at referendum time. In fact, it will be across all electoral events, and one would expect that we'll have, a longer lead in time. I mean, referendums very often are on the horizon for a long time before they actually happen, and so a commission can play a role in that regard in terms of being prepared and so on for referendums that are flagged and that are coming down the road. In terms of the regulation of campaign groups, that currently falls to our Standards and Public Offices Commission. So that's the spending and donations piece, and that falls under that particular SIPA, what's it called, Standards and Public Offices Commission. That spending and donations regime, the intention would be, it's not transferring across in the current proposals that are in the electoral reform bill. Those functions don't transfer initially to an electoral commission. But the intention has been flagged that the Commission itself would be asked in its early days to review fully the spending and donations regime that's set out actually in the 1997 legislation, with a view to making recommendations on it, and then ultimately with a view to the regulatory functions under that legislation coming across to the Electoral Commission.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to David Jones, please. David.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask our witnesses about the designation process of lead campaigners. How could transparency in that process be improved? And should the Electoral Commission be applying a fit and proper test to those who are applying for designation, or be given powers to require one? Mr. Grieve.
I think the key thing for me is that I think the designation process needs to be taking place much earlier, because the problem, we certainly saw it with the Brexit referendum, was that designation ultimately, and because there was also two groups who were competing over designation for leave, took place at a late stage. And I think that was unfortunate. I think it's unfair on the campaign. So, in my mind, you need to get your designation set sorted out at an earlier point than actually happened. Now, that's one improvement. Looking back on it, we did consider, clearly, a choice had to be made of designation between the two leave campaigns. I have to say, I think with hindsight, I'm not sure that people are particularly critical of the decision that was taken by the Electoral Commission as to who should be designated. They did it on the basis, I think, of their own assessment as to which of the two groups appeared to be attracting the most support as a campaign group. Clearly, there are big implications about being designated. It's the money that you're going to get. And the other thing is, we have not yet had an occasion, but we might have an occasion when you end up with no campaign group coming forward to be designated for one side, in which case, should the other side get designated? And I think the general view that we came to was that at the moment the practice would be that nobody gets designation, but we think that may be wrong. We think actually if there is a campaign which wishes to be designated, it probably ought to get it. It might then provide a proper incentive on other people who are going to object to put together a campaign themselves. Fit and proper person test. I see this very similarly to a test you'd apply in the world of commerce or trusteeships. I mean, somebody who should be a person who doesn't have convictions for serious criminal offences, is not bankrupt, has not been disqualified as a company director, and has not got a history of making hate speech. I mean, those are sort of some basic qualifications which I think I would put down. We are entitled to expect a campaign to be conducted properly, for the returns to be carried out properly, and the financial auditing and accountability to be done properly, and for the campaign to be conducted in the spirit of democracy, which is what I put in hate speech as my suggestion. And I think as long as you confine it to that, I mean, I think that those are the sorts of disqualifications you would expect from somebody from standing for getting involved in public life. And I certainly wouldn't wish to extend it beyond that. But I do think there is grounds for having a fit and proper persons test if people are going to run a campaign which is going to receive, on the face of it, quite large quantities of public money.
Thank you. Baroness Stuart.
Yes, I would agree with what Dominic has said. Let me start with designation. I think much earlier. In terms of, we made provisions, what if there is no group coming forward to wish to be? I have to say, as the practical politician, I kind of then ask myself, what kind of national referendum are we? The other side can't even get someone who wants to campaign for it. But the problem with designating lead campaigns, which go across party political divides, and in a sense cease to exist after the one question has been answered, I think we should not lose sight of two very, very significant problems on this one. One is that usually in general elections, the winning side is responsible to implement the outcome of a referendum. And of course, the lead campaign does not have such a responsibility. And that's why, this was partly why 2016 was such an odd event, that the very group that campaigned for the other argument was left holding the baby, saying, and now you have to implement it. So I think we need to remember those difficulties. The second difficulty is that in general elections, we have, at the end of it, a winner who forms the government, and then we have got Her Majesty's loyal opposition, i.e. an acknowledgement of that one side has succeeded and the one who hasn't, it takes on a certain responsibility in its relationships. Now, if you're a country like Ireland that would have had its 40 referendums become part of the drumbeat of your daily conduct. We don't have that. And, it's arguable whether that's desirable. So for the lead campaigns, I think they have to have a broad spectrum of background. That's why I think that the decision was right, that when both Leave was designated, we could demonstrate the broadest of buy-in. But it has to be much earlier, because your earlier witness, for example, I thought Scott Martin was very interesting when he commented on the relationship with the Electoral Commission and their advice. If you've got regular contacts with them, you have a different relationship. I would also say I have some difficulties with political parties designating themselves as campaigning for a particular outcome, because with that then comes access to third-party political data, which is really, really very significant. I think we ought to look at that. And the proper person test, our report actually draws analogies with the way Ofcom operates. And of course, Ofcom has a continued expertise in doing this kind of thing. Whereas if it were to be the Electoral Commission to do that, Dominic's very short, sharp, and I think clearly defined test, I think for me will be sufficient.
Thank you. Dr. Renwick, anything to add?
Very little to add, just two quick points. Firstly, on the clarity of the designation process. I mean, I've read some things by people who were deeply involved in the designation on the Leave side in 2016, expressing concern about lack of transparency about the criteria. I guess as someone who was watching from the outside, given the criteria that the Electoral Commission had specified, there was no surprise in who got the designation. And I don't think anyone was particularly surprised in who got the designation there. So if there are problems with transparency in the detail of the criteria there, I think they're very much in the detail. I think essentially that system works pretty well. And then just on the point that Dominic and Gisela raised about designation of one campaigner only. So this issue arose, as Mr. Jones, you will be well aware, I'm sure, in the Welsh devolution referendum in 2011, when no group came forward for designation on the no side. And there was a feeling after that, and as a result of that, because the current rules say that you designate on both sides or neither, there was no designation on the yes side either. And the feeling that arose, as I understand, as a result of that, was that the lack of designated lead campaigners contributed to a lack of information generally about that vote, and therefore less voter engagement with the vote. And therefore, in the legislation permitting subsequent referendums, there has been provision allowing a kind of limited designation to take place on one side if there isn't a suitable group on the other side. And we concluded in our commission that should be maintained.
And as I understand it, in the circumstances recommended, the designated lead group would have less access to public finances and so on. Is that right?
Yes, exactly so. So there would be limited provision to ensure that there was access to minimal funds. I forget now the exact detail of what we recommended on that, but it's in the report. But so you wouldn't want a scenario when there was very great inequality introduced between the two sides as a result of the lack of designation on one side.
Okay, thank you very much.
To Lloyd Russell-Moyle and then to Tom Randall. Lloyd.
I'm struck very much, Giza, by your Baroness Edgbaston, on your suggestion that the part of the problem is that lead campaigns don't have any responsibility to implement the outcome. It's easier, isn't it, when it's just a legislative tweak on a constitution of words. When it's to implement something a bit more significant, it seems much harder. Is there a case particularly in referendums that are not just about do you approve this wording change, so they are more substantive like the EU one, but even like setting up parliaments, is there a case maybe to require the lead campaigns to last for longer and be involved in the implementation one way or another, either through some advisory committee or through some implementing body, rather than it just then going back to the government or the authority, which might have been hostile to the proposition in the first place?
I think what you're really putting your finger on is the problems when referendums are called in order to deal with situations which have more to do with party management and all those kinds of things, rather than trying to arrive at a new constitutional settlement. So, for example, if you compare kind of three moments in history, if we go on fighting the last war and think about Europe. So the referendum campaign under Harold Wilson, where the government did send out 2 leaflets of equal size and prominence. I think to this day, nobody's entirely clear how Harold Wilson himself voted. And cabinet responsibility was lifted. So you've had one sort of clear where you had those kind of positions. I then really wanted a referendum on the EU in 2005 in the wake of the Lisbon Treaty, where you had a significant piece of legislation which would have redefined our relationship, which did redefine our relationship with the European Union. And a referendum in those circumstances would have been about, do you want the future, which is described and defined here, or do you want to stick with the status quo, which is also defined and described here? I think the 2016 referendum, the problem of implementation was so specific to those circumstances of a government that was so convinced that he would win, that it made not only there was the civil service not instructed to prepare for the possibility of a Leave victory. As I understand it, he was forbidden for doing so. So I think rather than trying to create new bodies, I think it comes back to thoughtful legislation, how you prepare for outcomes and how you deal with that.
The reason I ask is if you look at the referendum in Chile for constitutional change, the outcome was yes, but then what happened was a special constitutive assembly was established with all the respective campaigners, but in proportion to the vote that they had just received. And it is their body responsibility to then implement the constitutional change referendum. And that's an example that we see playing out at the moment. It might be a disaster. Let's see what happens at the end of that process. But I wonder if there is place for that, or is it just always a case that 2016 was a one-off, and we probably shouldn't create rules for that one-off mess that we got ourselves into?
I mean, if I may to come back again, I think again you're looking at a much wider question here. Are we a society that is moving incrementally away from a first past the post representative parliamentary democracy towards one that increasingly becomes a participatory democracy, where the elected representatives are no longer parliamentary sufficiency for the democratic process, and therefore we want to add other processes? That is perfectly possible, but I do think we then have to think through the consequences of it rather than just tacking this on because something hasn't worked in a particular instance. No,
I agree. Dominic, you wanted to come back on that?
Well, I agree with Gisela about this very much, because unfortunately, I'm not sure that the referendum of 2016 is necessarily a one-off. It may be a one-off in the sense that a question was asked which then required very complex and detailed implementation, in the course of which some of the original ideas that were being floated at the time of the referendum never really materialized and disappeared, leading to polarization and people arguing that the original referendum question and the answer given by the electorate could no longer be seen as completely relevant because we were in a complete new world. But it could happen again. Let's just take an example. It could happen with the Scottish referendum. If there's a referendum for independence and there is no mechanism subsequently for a further review of whether people approve the package by which Scotland would have become independent, we could have exactly the same problem arise of ending up with detailed negotiations post-referendum, if it was a referendum for independence, which takes you to a place which is entirely different from where some people thought they might be when they voted. So this risk is there. Now, I agree with Gisela. The real change that I see about referendums is that if you're going to have them, they have got to have proper preparation. Mm-hmm. And there, I think you do need to start looking outside of Parliament and considering whether you want to have citizens' assemblies and discussions about what it is people are going to be voting on, and a national conversation on the subject that otherwise widens the scope of that conversation well outside Parliament. Yeah. Now, is that reconcilable with our current parliamentary system? With some difficulty, because Parliament has the monopoly at the moment, really, of those discussions, and sheds it with some reluctance, as we have seen. But I do think that that's what you need. And indeed, we were hearing from Barry Ryan, it does seem to me that Ireland, in terms of, for example, its referendum on abortion, had that conversation before the choice was made by the electorate. And I think we're lacking something there in the process. I agree with Gisela completely that it would need, I think, a very considerable change in our political culture.
No, thank you very much. I mean, I asked the question particularly because I worry that a lot of the enforcement post the 2016 referendum by the Electoral Commission, by people pushing the Electoral Commission, etc., was actually about people not very happy with the process in which the referendum took place. not necessarily actually enforcement, and they were trying to do something that actually the rules weren't designated for. So it's about, is there other relief valves that we can achieve rather than trying to get the Electoral Commission to worry about every T crossed and I dotted, when actually that's not where the public really were concerned about.
I understand the point, and it's a valid one. There are some things that can be looked at, and our inquiry looked at them. For example, the current rules allow for easy circumvention of limits on spending by multiple registration of smaller groups. I mean, these are, I have to say, I think readily curable, but they do exist. And you were talking earlier, to the earlier panel, about speeding up expenses registration and audited accounts. All those things, I think, actually feature in our report, and we'd be very much in favour of. Not letting this thing drag out afterwards, so that everybody knows what it is they're supposed to be doing. So, yes, I think those are things you can do. But as I say, I also agree with Gisela about some of the basic underlying issues.
And just a couple of other points in our report on this, if I may. One is, Dominic has absolutely rightly emphasised the importance of preparing for a referendum. And if you have a referendum that is well prepared for and people have thought about what the options are on the ballot paper, then that, I think, helps. And the Irish experience, I think, shows that citizens' assemblies can assist Parliament. Citizens' assemblies are not an alternative to Parliament. They don't subvert the role of Parliament. They can assist Parliament in dealing with these complex issues. And secondly, we explored the idea in our report of double referendum processes. If you have a case where you need to put a proposal to voters that is very much a framework, a vote on a principle rather than a detailed worked out option, there may be circumstances in which it's desirable to have a second referendum at the end of
the
working
New Zealand
out the detail.
flag kind of option,
Well, that's a slightly different case where there were 6 options, if I remember, firstly on the ballot paper, and then those were whittled down to 2. What we're talking about here is a process where you have the 2 options in principle, the 2 basic principles on the ballot paper, and then you work out the detail of the proposal. And we were very clear that this was not about a campaign for having a second Brexit referendum. We were very clear that if you're going to have 2 referendums, then you need to set out that process before the first referendum, not suddenly surprise people with a second referendum halfway through. But something like that might be desirable in some circumstances.
Thank you all very much. We're going to move to almost canter pace, I think, now with Tom Randall, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I wonder if I could just ask some questions on the Electoral Commission's role in the regulation of referendum campaign finance. And if I could come first to you, Dr. Renwick, and then Mr. Green and Baroness Stuart. I wondered how could the transparency of campaign funding and spending in referendums be improved, particularly given the rise of digital campaigning? And do you think that any changes would require legislative changes or changes in the conduct of the Electoral Commission?
Thank you. Let me say 4 things very, very quickly in the spirit of cantering. So firstly, better transparency for donations. So at present, the law requires, PIPERA requires weekly donation reporting during general election campaigns, but it doesn't require that in referendums. There's been ad hoc provision for referendums for reporting every sort of 2, 3, 4 weeks. There's no reason not to have reporting every week in referendums as in general elections. Second, tighter reporting deadlines. So as was mentioned earlier, for spending, tighter deadlines for reporting spending. As was mentioned, that's currently 3 months after the referendum for smaller campaign groups and 6 months for larger campaign groups. Our report suggested going down to 3 months for all of those groups. There was discussion earlier of whether it would be possible to go further and have real-time reporting of spending, just as there is already real-time reporting of donations. And I was interested to hear that the 3 witnesses earlier didn't instantly say you can't possibly do that, it's impractical, which I thought they might. So I think that possibility certainly deserves further attention. The only reason not to do it that I can see is that it would be practically difficult and would impose problematic burdens on campaign groups. Then thirdly, better transparency, particularly in online spending. So at the moment, the requirements in the legislation for how spending is reported make it difficult for the Electoral Commission to see exactly what has been spent online and how it has been spent. So improving the rules on that, I think, would be important. And then finally, as has been mentioned quite a lot, clearly the rules on joint spending are not clear enough. They're not actually in PIPERA. They've been in the ad hoc legislation for particular referendums, and clearly there's a need for better, clearer rules on that. So all of those points require fresh legislation, not just action by the Electoral Commission.
Just to pick up on that last point, Dr. Renwick, on joint spending, do you think changes need to be made sort of in legislation or otherwise to sort of clarify that point?
I think changes required in legislation. So the rules should be in PIPERA, not merely in the ad hoc legislation for a particular referendum, and they should be clear, such that the Electoral Commission is able to give the sort of guidance that we heard earlier it was not able to give before the 2016 referendum.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Grieve.
Well, where it's a canter, I agree with everything that Dr. Renwick has just said. And I'm not sure that there's a huge amount to add. Clearly, some of these things do need new legislation because they are not in PIPERA. And I entirely agree, and I really think this is the key point. This shouldn't be something which has to be done when you bring through the legislation for the particular referendum. You need to have it in the background already with a structure there, and you need to have very good reasons then to depart from it. But I think provided you do that, you can get around some of the problems which undoubtedly arose in 2016 and caused so much difficulty to the campaigns. So quite apart from it, it's in everybody's interest that should happen. There are some issues, I think, on data acquisition, which perhaps need to be looked at, and that's something which needs a link up between the Electoral Commission and the ICO. That's it.
Thank you. Baroness Stuart.
Absolutely agree with both what Alan Renwick and Dominic Grieve have said. And I just want to stress one of the points Dominic made. Because referendums, when they're called, there's always a political edge to them, and you will know the government will have a view on this and Parliament will have a view on this. So therefore, to have the legislation as a standard legislation that is already in place and applies to elections and referendums equally, and departure will have to be justified for the specific legislation, I think is really important. And I'd also slightly go back to the earlier discussion we had about Section 125, and when the spending by state actors, as I'd like to call them, is problematic. The key points, the quicker reporting is perfectly possible, and have a standard framework.
Thank you all. Thank you, Chairman.
I'm not sure if Mr. Cowan has a supplementary question.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just curious. Actually, you touched on that last point there. I've still got an issue here where, call them what you will, an individual, a maverick, wants to spend money on a campaign, whatever side they're on, and they're not affiliated to a party, they're not part of an official campaign. What is it to stop an individual spending their own money to say, I support this campaign or I oppose this campaign? And how can they be held to account by anybody?
Mr. Khan, what do you wish them to be held accountable for?
Well, that's the question, that they're spending money on a campaign. We're trying to say to campaigns, here's your spending limit, this is how you can spend it. As an individual, if I'm some sort of maverick billionaire, which I'm not either of, I could buy television adverts, newspaper adverts, billboards, and influence the mindset of the population for whatever my political belief was. There's nothing to stop me doing that. So, but at the same time, we're being quite pernicious in our control of political parties, saying how much money can you spend, or if I create an organisation and then register that organisation, as I've been asked to do, I would then be limited in what I can spend and how I can spend that money.
So I'd need to go back and reread Pipera, but my recollection is that the requirement that you register if you spend more than £10,000 applies to an individual, just as it does.
I think it does. I think it does too. I don't think an individual can just go and spend £5 million of their own money to say whatever they like in the course of a campaign. I'm sure they have to register.
Okay.
Well, in that case, I'll keep my money in my pocket then.
Righty-ho.
Process we've had probably when Jimmy Goldsmith started the Referendum Party and spent massive money, but he had to, you have to register as a political party, or there's a process, and the history of people trying to purchase the views in liberal democracies is actually not a very successful one.
Okay, thank you very much. To Rachel Hopkins, please.
Thank you, Chair. And this is just to add further to the discussion. First to Baroness Stuart and then Dominic Grieve and Alan Renwick. Do you think the Electoral Commission has the appropriate powers, structures and expertise to monitor and enforce complex technical investigations on suspected campaign funding? Expertise to monitor and enforce complex technical investigations on suspected campaign funding and spending breaches? And is it
Alan Halsall's evidence and his suggestion that once you move into the criminal sphere, this notion of being a prosecutor is not right. And I think it was also Scott Martin who kind of reminded us of the current postmaster scandal, where the use of private prosecutions by the post office has created a massive, enormous injustice. So I would say that we should take on board that sometimes the Electoral Commission is hampered by the lack of clarity in the legislation it has to deal with. I thought the criticism of that the Electoral Commission sort of regards year zero and doesn't go back to that was a valid one. I also thought it was a valid observation that, particularly in relation to referendums, there is very little case law which is followed up to confirm that. But I think there has to be a robustness that demonstrate their own impartiality, and I think the last few years have not served them well.
I agree with Gisela completely on her last comment. The Electoral Commission in the 2016 referendum, in my view, was overtaken by the magnitude of the problems and the task that was placed upon it. Before one starts saying that's the Commission, well, perhaps the next stage is to say, what is the remedy? Because it was not necessarily some inefficiency or ineffectiveness on the Commission's part about the way, but about the fact that it had been structured in a way which did not enable it to deal with this type of problem as it arose. And I think the interesting question, and it may be one of the key questions for this committee, if I understand what it's looking at, is it better to keep the Electoral Commission as a regulator, but to leave any enforcement to some other body? Or is it the regulator which should be doing the enforcing? Now, there I have some mixed feelings on this. I should explain that in the background, before I went into Parliament, I did a lot of prosecuting for a very good regulator prosecutor, which was the Health and Safety Executive. And history showed that when there were attempts sometimes by the police to interfere in HSC decision-making and second-guess it and bring prosecutions of their own, which they were capable of doing, they usually went wrong. And it was a trend which I didn't think was very satisfactory. The HSC was able to combine being a regulator, advising, bringing civil proceedings, because it could do that in certain circumstances, imposing penalties, and prosecuting. I don't think it's impossible for a regulator to do those things, although I accept that the area of elections and referendums is politically very controversial, and that therefore it's bound to give rise, if there is enforcement, to political agitation, because there will be some people who will be upset and concerned about what happened. We've seen this happen with general election, with prosecutions brought as a result of elections. So I'm not sure the best way in which this should be dealt with. All I am quite sure about is that the current position is not satisfactory. Because it seems to me that the regulator has got to have powers and has got to have teeth if it's going to bring its own prosecutions. But then, of course, you've also got to bear in mind the rules have got to be right and the laws in the PPPERA have got to be right. Without that, everybody's going to be floundering around and the regulator will have as much trouble as anybody else. To my mind, there were certainly things that went on in the referendum in 2016, which I think were profoundly unsatisfactory. I never wish to see them happen again. And they ought to be capable of firstly being prohibited, and secondly, if the rules are broken, there have to be sanctions.
I don't have expertise on the enforcement question that's been discussed, so I'm not going to comment on that. But I think it's vital that the powers are not only exercised fairly and impartially, but also they're seen as being exercised fairly impartially. And for that, there's, I think, an important question around the governance of the Electoral Commission. So there was a period when there were a number of vacancies among commissioners, and that has now largely been resolved. But I think it's undesirable to get into that situation. And I think a second important governance point is that oversight of the Commission needs to be both cross-party and non-party. And cross-party oversight is provided, at least in part, through the Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission. And as I commented in my written submission to the committee, I think it's very regrettable that for the first time ever at present, there is a one-party majority on the Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission, specifically the governing party. That has never happened before. Where in the 2005 Parliament, when the government majority was similar to the current government majority, there were 3 government members and 5 opposition members. And that seems to be a much healthier form of governing arrangement that protects the impartiality of the Electoral Commission. And I would hope that this committee would encourage the Speaker, who is primarily responsible for the Speaker's Committee, to ensure that the current situation should not arise again.
Thank you. You've touched on part of the sort of supplementary, but I'll ask it in case anyone wants to add about any changes in law or practice that may be necessary to ensure the Commission's monitoring and sanctioning functions are rigorously impartial and to ensure a level playing field between the different sides in a referendum. We've touched on it, but if anyone has anything specific to add, please do.
No, I think we've covered that point.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Final thing is about other regulators and whether should the Electoral Commission work with other regulators in regulating spending and the use of personal data in political campaigning.
And Dominic made the point about the Information Commissioner's Office, and I think that's the key connection there, and there needs to be strong interaction between the Electoral Commission and the ICO.
Thank you. Any others?
No, that was exactly the point I made. That there is clearly, I think, need. In fairness, we did this report in 2018, and I'm conscious that that's something which might be happening already, and we just don't know about. But it was something that you might like to check up on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
I just want to add, I mean, given during this pandemic, we have the public view on the use of its own data. There's been much greater awareness, but also its pros and cons, So I really think it is worth having a very close look, because the emergence and the evolution of the use of data, I think, is a key aspect where legislation has not yet caught up with it, and the Information Commissioner is key in that relationship.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Back to Karen Smith, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Ryan, back to you on campaign funding. Can you just highlight for us what changes are envisaged by Irish ministers in the general scheme to improve the transparency and accountability on referendum campaign funding?
Yeah, well, look, I think as I explained earlier, the reform bill that's currently being progressed has a number of key elements. One is obviously the establishment of an independent statutory electoral commission. Secondly, the oversight of the electoral register, which is being modernised, as well as a modernisation process as well being legislated for in the bill. And the third key element is regulation, for the first time, regulation of online political advertising. So the political and donations and spending regime that's governed by the 1997 legislation isn't at this point in time encompassed by the electoral reform bill. But the intention is that the Commission, when up and running, would undertake a full review of the 97 legislation. Complex piece of legislation there since 1997. Has been heavily amended over the years. There's probably some 20 amending pieces of legislation in relation to that. So asking a Commission to review it, make recommendations back, and then ultimately to transfer the responsibility for the regulation of the spending and donations regime to the Electoral Commission when it's established.
Why was that not included in the first time?
Yeah, I guess the proposals that are being advanced at this stage, they really emanate from a report from Parliamentary Committee back in 2016, which looked at the establishment of an electoral commission, amongst other things. And the recommendations at that time were to establish the commission on a statutory basis initially, with an initial set of functions, with a view to building on those functions over time. And the transfer of other statutory functions to the Commission. I suppose it's highlighted that the approach shouldn't be a big bang approach, is what they call it, that Electoral Commission from day one would have full responsibility for everything. I guess somebody likened it, I think at one stage, that we're trying to change the wheels on the car as the car continues on down the motorway. So it's a stepped approach was favoured, and that was reinforced. There was a public consultation took place at the back end of 2018 and into 2019 on a regulatory impact analysis that had been conducted on the proposals, and that public consultation again favoured an approach which would see the establishment of the body on a statutory basis with an initial set of functions, with other functions to transfer in over time. When the Commission, I guess, becomes established and builds capacity.
But then there's no date on that, is there?
No, there is no specific date on it, but it is earmarked as one of the early pieces, if you like, of research and advice that a Commission would be asked to report back on, would be the provisions that are in the 97 legislation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So Lloyd Russell-Moore again, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Alan, Dominic and Gisela, I guess, in that order. What role should the Electoral Commission play in disseminating and regulating campaign information, particularly in light of the rise of online campaigning, so voters feel confident by the decisions they make? I mean, I was taken by the idea that you put forward around an online registry or library of some of the campaigns. But should the Electoral Commission get involved in the actual content of any of that, and how do they regulate it online particularly?
Thank you. There are many types of information. So one sort of information is about when is the referendum taking place, how can you vote, who can vote, where can you vote, what's the question on the ballot paper, all that kind of thing. And the Electoral Commission already has the role of providing that kind of information, and I think it's entirely appropriate that it should continue to do so. There's also information on explaining the choice available to voters, explaining what the two options are. So the Electoral Commission was given that power in the 2011 referendum on the alternative voting system, when it provided information explaining what is the alternative vote and what is first past the post. So just basically explaining those two options. And Barry Ryan has referred to the referendum commissions in Ireland, and they, to a somewhat greater extent, perform a similar kind of function. So something like that could certainly be done by the Electoral Commission. Then you can get braver still in providing further information around what are the sorts of arguments for and against the options on the ballot paper, what's the evidence around these arguments. And this is done in a number of places. So New Zealand, for some of its referendums at least, has set up a body that has been responsible for working out, well, what are the main kind of claims, what are the arguments that people are interested in. So when they had a referendum also on the voting system, as we did in 2011, they had a commission that looked at what are the sorts of issues that matter to people in this referendum, and questions around the proportionality of the system, representativeness of different groups in society, the effectiveness of government, things like that. And they looked at what's the evidence on how the different systems perform against different criteria for evaluating them, essentially. And that worked very well in New Zealand. And something kind of similar operates in some American states, where you have, rather than an expert body doing that, you have a citizens' assembly, or a similar body to a citizens' assembly, that provides a kind of informed public view on which arguments that people are making make sense during the campaign. Where do they want more information? What are they satisfied with in the campaign? I think information provision such as this, I'm going a bit beyond what the Independent Commission on Referendums said. This is more based on my own research. I think information provision such as that would be an excellent development in our referendum practice in the UK, but I wouldn't give that function to the Electoral Commission. It potentially is quite a controversial function, particularly on a polarised issue, and clearly the Electoral Commission already has potentially controversial functions, and you don't want a body that has multiple difficult jobs potentially contaminating each other in terms of the degree to which the institution is trusted. So the Lords Committee report that I mentioned earlier, the Democracy and Digital Technologies Committee, developed some very interesting proposals around how you might be able to do this, and I think that would be very welcome. And then I guess finally, we see, stepping back a little bit from referendums specifically, we see a great deal of distrust of politicians and politics and the whole political system. And I think that partly reflects a public sense of disengagement, lack of understanding, and I think it's really important to think about how we could counter that through, many things, but in part, better education, education in schools, better education around just how the political system operates, so that people can understand what role referendums play within the system and other parts of the system. And again, potentially the Electoral Commission has a part of the role of providing that, particularly with regard to elections and referendums. But it would be important for others to be involved in that provision as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
The only thing, it seems to me that Dr. Renwick has set out very clearly the options. The one thing that I'm absolutely clear about is that you can't have the Electoral Commission or another body fact-checking campaign groups and telling them that they can or can't say something. I think that's the one thing that I'm absolutely clear about in my own mind. And on that, you have to rely on the fact that there are now, within respectable media, quite a few organisations that do run that sort of fact-checking process, which I think people do tend to actually refer to and find quite helpful. But it cannot be done by the Electoral Commission. Tempting as it might sound.
There are guidelines for say, at the general election, when each member standing for Parliament, each person standing for Parliament, is allowed to give a free post address via Royal Mail. Royal Mail does review the content of that, And if they find that the content goes beyond just positive promotion of your side to beyond their guidelines, they don't allow you to send it out. And I'm not saying they fact check it, but they do have a role there. I mean, is there a role in referendum that should be something similar to that candidates have to abide by in a general election, at least?
Well, I think that raises a very interesting question. You're absolutely right about that, and that's because ultimately libel laws apply during the course of general elections, and you're referring to a particular candidate. And indeed, it is under some circumstances, you might be able to get an election result overturned if you put out something which was suggesting that your opponent was a criminal, for example, when it wasn't true. So yes, harder with referendums because you're dealing with concepts and ideas. But my instinct tells me that we're going to get into very hot water if I know that other places do it. But I just think that isn't what the role of the Electoral Commission should be. Now, Renwick has spoken about other possibilities of the Electoral Commission putting out its own, an organisation, if not the Electoral Commission, putting out information, factual information, on an almost statutory footing during the course of a referendum. That is something which could be contemplated, although it does then raise risks that one party or other to the referendum will say that it's inaccurate. And how then, and who then adjudicates upon that? That, I think, is where the problem lies.
Fantastic. Gisa, I mean, one of your final recommendations of the report is around this searchable repository for online political advertising should be developed, including information on where the advertisement was posted, to whom it was targeted, and how much was spent on it. Was that recommendation around real-time reporting, or is that just post-reporting? And if it's post-reporting, is there not the same problem that we have discussed with the finances of this, that the horse has already bolted?
I think, and unless Alan's and Dominic's recollection is different, I think when it came to that bit which was dealing with online, we kind of were struggling, or kind of we knew that this was a fast-moving field which actually went well beyond just the referendums, that it also applied to general elections and all sorts of other things. But I would observe that the irony does not escape me of that at a time where information and that you could check information is so much more readily available for those who wish to find it. And yet we've got ourselves into a position that you hardly ever in political discourse get someone to say, I disagree with you. They say, you're lying. And we've got to a position where contestable propositions have morphed into truth and lies. And I think that is a really sad place to be in. And probably it is a reflection that we have a more adversarial political culture than electoral systems which have got proportional representation and consensus seeking and coalitions afterwards. I don't know what the reason is, but for the purposes of your inquiry, I think if you wish to destroy the Electoral Commission, you would give them that task.
Yeah. Just to add to that, since we published our report, the various tech companies have established ad libraries for digital advertising, which is a very welcome development. And so these are, in real time, being updated all the time. The difficulty is that they give very little information on how much is being spent, how the money is being targeted, who is being targeted. And in order for voters really to be able to see what is happening in the campaign, and for the regulator to be able to monitor that, it's important for there to be more information provided on this advertising. And again, the DCMS committee has set out proposals on that.
It seems like it's technically possible. It's just that we need to get the standardisation and regulation right for the information to be provided.
Yes, and to make quite clear, I mean, there ought to be an imprint on all digital advertising in exactly the same way as it has to appear on print.
Yes, no, thank you very much. And I suspect, Gisela, your point about truth might also link to the nature of truth in a more postmodernistic world that we could probably have a whole lecture on and discussion, which is beyond the realms of this committee, but would be fascinating. Thank you very much.
Chair, if I may just come in on that, just to highlight the proposals that I outlined in our electoral reform bill, which do include the regulation of online political advertising, very much along the lines that have been suggested here, with a transparency notice on each political advert, and the creation of those ads being in ad libraries on the platforms.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryan, and because I think Mr. McDonnell has been waiting very patiently and has our concluding questions, and I think you touched on one of his potential questions. But Mr. McDonnell, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Chair. I think a contestable truth becomes a lie when it's knowingly falsely promoted. That we'll come back to that debate, I'm sure, time and time again. Barry, the Chair is asking us to go at a canter, so this is the last fence, okay. I think you've made the point very, very clear about the importance of provision of public information on education on referenda in Ireland. I think you've made that point. But one of the questions that we did want to ask is about this proposed move of the Electoral Commission in regulating political advertising. Could you just fill us in a bit about what prompted that and what that move will mean in effect?
Sure, I will, and we'll try not to fall off the last fence. The background to this was an interdepartmental group which was established back in 2017 actually, and chaired by the Department of Taoiseach, which brought together a number of different stakeholders to look at Ireland's electoral processes and particularly disinformation. That group produced 2 reports and actually found that, in terms of a risk analysis, found our processes to be relatively robust. But ultimately, we did recommend that proposals be brought forward in this space, specifically in terms of regulating online political advertising during electoral events. And so they are the proposals that are currently being brought forward, and the proposals attempt to ensure that there is a transparency notice attached to each political advertisement that appears online, and very much, as I guess, mirrors what's there in the offline space of highlighting who sponsors the ad, who's been targeted, and that information to be provided in real time. I should say it's not a silver bullet to solve all of the issues in relation to activity that happens online. But alongside our legislation, there is also being progressed at the moment by colleagues in the Department of Justice an online safety and media regulation bill, which will see the creation of an online safety commissioner and the establishment separately of a media commission, which deals more broadly with issues of online material. The proposals in the legislation that I'm leading on specifically, as I say, are targeted towards political advertising during electoral events.
I think you safely got over that fence, Barry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that note, can I thank our 4 witnesses of this panel, in addition to the thanks to the 3 witnesses in the first, for an extremely enlightening session, conducted, I think, very well indeed, given the sometimes contentious natures of these particular issues. I thought it was conducted extremely well, and my thanks go to you all. Order, order.